Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
Jason, would you please introduce John Tamny to the listeners?
Alan, we're joined on the phone by John Tamny. He is the editor of Real Clear Markets and Forbes Opinions. He's also a senior economic advisor to H.C. Wainwright Economics.
And he's been on TV a lot lately. I sent him an email when I saw him on one TV show, and by the time he had replied, he was on another TV show. So you're all over the place.
It sounds like it. Yeah, I guess they're desperate for guests these days on the cable.
I know. I thought you are probably only the second person that I have ever seen on television who actually knew the true rate of unemployment, the true inflation rate, and that was the thing that impressed me. I get so tired of hearing that bogus number that comes out of the government. I said, that guy knows what's going on. Would you explain to the listeners, first of all, how government spending is what is keeping this economy down?
Well, on government spending, it's fairly easy to explain. Let's be fair here. The government has no resources. So for the government to spend money, it's not it being generous with us. It's basically taking money from us and destroying it. We live in a world of limited capital, and government, by definition, they would acknowledge they tend to waste money. They want to spend it, and so it's better to leave it in the private sector where it's forced into market-oriented things that actually create wealth.
Well, John, if with this bogus GDP number they keep throwing out, if you understate inflation by, right now about 70%, you can create this mythical GDP number, and the Keynesians are always driven by that GDP number when really it doesn't have anything to do with it. And I would argue they're taking the capital out of the market that our entrepreneurs need to drive the economy forward.
Absolutely. GDP is charitably a worthless number. It is so misunderstood, and the last thing a country would ever want to do is judge its economy based on national output. That's what the Soviet Union did. That's what communist China did. It's just not relevant to the world we live in. And certainly you're right. They can overstate GDP right now by basically redefining what inflation is. 20, 30 years ago, inflation was very basic. It was a decline in the value of money, and you use gold as the evidence of that inflation. Since 2001, a dollar bought 1/250th of an ounce of gold in 2001. Today, 1/1600th. We've had massive inflation for 10 years in the United States, but the government's redefined it so as to keep GDP up.
Well, and I think they're getting ready to redefine it again now, since you seem to have a pretty good command on the figures. The one thing I think the official rate, the CPIU right now, the number they're touting is about 3.2%. If we go back to the methodology that was used prior to the Clinton administration change, we're right around 7%. I've seen statistics that say if we go back to the Reagan era, we're up around 11%. Do you agree with those figures?
Without question. Inflation as government measures it, it's easy to get the number you want just by changing the composition of the CPI. And so I don't know why anyone's taking the CPI that we have today seriously at all. And I find it really disappointing that so many Republicans that would claim that they are Reagan types and that Reagan basically has animated their views of the world, that they would actually believe that there's no inflation in the system right now. Reagan would never have been so fooled because he understood that the gold signal was the single best measure of it, and gold's been skyrocketing.
Well, John, talking about government manipulations, they've certainly manufactured a crisis, or at least a perceived crisis up there in Washington, generating a lot of fear over this debt ceiling debate. But in a recent article in Real Clear Markets, you've argued that we've already defaulted, and we've defaulted several times in our history.
Oh, yeah, without question. There are two ways to default. You can default by seizing payment on interest owed on government debt due. That's one way that governments can do it. But the other obvious way that they've done it for really centuries and millennium really is by clipping the currency or devaluing the currency. If you look at the dollar over the last 10 years, and really if you look at the dollar since 1971, when we removed its gold definition, we've been defaulting on our debt for quite some time. If we devalue the dollar, which is what we do, by definition, we're paying back creditors less than what we borrowed from them.
John, based on even the most ambitious reduction in government spending, I mean, it looks to me like if you count the increase in unfunded liabilities, tacking on an additional, almost $40 trillion over the next 10 years. And if that's the case, I mean, I would argue we could be looking at another 80-90% decline in the value of a dollar if that plan were to be adopted. Is that a overly pessimistic scenario?
I think it's partially over pessimistic. I mean, certainly neither the Republicans or the Democrats have any desire to actually reduce the size of government. I mean, it amazed me when Paul Ryan's plan came out, which calls for 31% annual spending increases, that they were saying that this was a step in the right direction of reducing the size of government. It was the exact opposite. But when you think of the dollar, I've always believed, and I think there's some truth to it, that the Treasury can make its price whatever it wants. The Treasury can say tomorrow that the dollar is redeemable at, say, 1/800th of an ounce of gold or 1/500th of an ounce of gold. And so I think we could arrest the dollar's decline, but the problem is there's no interest on the part of either party. Neither party understands what inflation is to actually stop the dollar's decline, and that scares me to death. We're just not going to have an economic recovery with a weak dollar.
I don't have my notes in front of me, but it looks like to balance, based on our income right now of $2.1 trillion, we need to pull back down to about the 2003 level of spending on the government. And I can think back to 2003. Things were a lot better back then than they are today.
They certainly were, and let's take it back even further. I want to say the last Clinton budget was $1.8 trillion. I don't remember that being a time of hardship, and by definition, it could not be. Governments don't have resources to spend money; they can only take it from us first. And so, this fear that we're going to be out on the streets if the government shrinks in size is laughable. It's logically laughable, and that the Republicans are afraid to force this and basically sit on their hands and say, you know what, we're not going to raise the debt ceiling at all. This is how we're going to reduce the size of government. It kind of concerns me that this isn't obvious to them.
What route would you take right now if we could make you king for the day? What would you do?
The one thing I would do, because I think it's more important than all of this, is we've got to stabilize the dollar. I would redefine the dollar tomorrow in terms of some sort of gold price. I'd probably do it based on the 10-year average to make debtors and creditors as equal as possible. But you can't have the sole purpose of money is to facilitate the exchange of goods and to assign value to investment so that there are not major errors made. You can't have a major recovery with the dollar continuing in its weak direction. So once you fix the dollar, I think a lot of the problems that we're discussing right now go away, and so that would be my number one thing.
How do you feel about this Fed mechanism we've got? Are you pro-Fed, anti-Fed? I mean, I'm not a big fan of the Federal Reserve. I'd like to get rid of it, but just wondering what your thoughts were.
I would too. The dollar is the most important price in the world, but the price of credit is the second most. And so the last thing you'd want is a central bank distorting it. You want markets to set the price of credit so you can equalize debtors and borrowers and lenders. Secondly, I don't see the need for the Fed as a lender of last resort because lots of businesses have lots of cash on hand and they would gladly lend at a penalty rate. After that, you can't make an argument that the Fed's existence has been good for the dollar, although I think we have to blame the Treasury a lot for that. So I don't see the purpose of the Fed, and I think it's particularly scary right now, the Fed's mandate, which is to match unemployment with economic growth. This Fed believes that economic growth causes inflation. That's impossible. Never in the history of the world has growth caused inflation. This Fed believes it, and as a result, its actions are a huge weight on not just U.S. but global economic growth.
Well, what do you think that individual people can be doing right now to protect themselves against this decline, both in the short term and in the longer term outlook?
Well, sadly, and people are going to think of me a bit strange for saying this, I think staying in your house is one of the best things you can do. As von Mises long ago observed, when money is being devalued, there's a flight to the real, into hard, tangible objects that people can hold on to that are least vulnerable to devaluation. And so actually owning a house right now is not a bad thing. You can live in it, and it's probably being propped up to some degree by the dollar's decline. After that, you want to be, and sadly, again, rare art, stamps, oil, gold, anything like that tends to go up when the dollar is devalued. Let's stress here that that's a hugely negative economic signal. When money is devalued, investment goes into the assets that already exist. Conversely, when money is strong and stable, investment goes into stocks and bonds, basically investment into income streams of assets that don't yet exist. So devaluation is always a blast to the past, and that's why during periods of devaluation, the 1970s and then the Bush and Obama years, are always bad economically.
Well, John, we're going to have to leave it right there. We certainly appreciate your time. We've been speaking with John Tamny, the editor of Real Clear Markets and Forbes Opinions.
John, we'd love to have you on again real soon.
Anytime. Glad to do it.